Just say it, man. Don't make me ask 20 questions.
What is the point?
Get to the point.
Just say it already!
Welcome to the Podcram. Let's listen to Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett explain emotions on Huberman Lab. Strap yourself in for a long one. I cut an hour off the original runtime, but there's still 90 minutes of material left, so I'll try to shrink it down again in the future.
2.5 years, 1,000 papers later, we all very reasonably came to consensus that there was no evidence for facial expressions of emotion being universal. And that instead, what there's clear evidence of is that the way that people move their faces in moments of expression is highly variable. Meta-analyses, so statistical summaries of many studies, show that people scowl about 35% of the time when they're angry, which is more than chance. So it gets you a good publication in, the proceedings of the National Academy. But that means 65% of the time, people are moving their faces in other meaningful ways. That's not scowling. So if you actually used a scowl, or even, a scowl and blood pressure, or, just maybe not one signal, but a couple signals, but you would be wrong more than half the time. You would miss more than half the cases. So there's low reliability for the correspondence between a scowl and anger. Scowling is one expression of anger, but it's certainly not the dominant one. And there is no dominant one. It's just highly variable depending on the situation that you're in. So sometimes when I'm angry, I sit quietly and plot the demise of my enemy. Sometimes I smile in anger. Sometimes I cry in anger. It really depends on the situation. But more importantly, half of the scowls that people make are not related to anger. That means if you see someone scowling, the chances are that they might not be angry. They might be concentrating really hard, or they might have gas. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why people make a scowl. And we found this for every emotion category that had ever been studied. And I want you to notice what I just did there. I'm no longer referring to an emotion as if it's an entity or a thing. So anger isn't one thing. It's a category of things, a grouping of things.
And if I'm not mistaken, it includes verbs, right? That like anger as a set of verb actions in the brain and body.
Yes.
Right? It's a process. It's
a
not
process.
An event.
Exactly. Right? It's not a noun. It's a verb. And it's a process. But the point is that it's a highly variable grouping of instances. If you are talking about all instances of anger that you have ever experienced or witnessed is a highly variable grouping of instances that vary. That doesn't mean they're random, but what the body does in anger depends on what the physical movements will be in anger. And that depends on the situation that you're in and what your goal is.
A previous guest on this podcast, Dr. Carl Deisseroth, said something which really stuck with me. We don't really know how other people feel at all. In fact, most of the time, we don't even know how we feel. And that prompted the question for me about how good or poor are we at gauging our own emotional states, and in particular at labeling them, both to others and for ourselves. And so here's the direct question. Is language sufficient to capture this incredibly complex thing that we're calling emotions? So for instance, the other day I was in New York with my sister, then she left, I went out for a bit, I was having a pretty good day, and then I returned to the place where I was staying, and I was hit with this feeling of intense loneliness. And I don't know why. And then I had a bunch of ideas about how that related to growing up and but I was going to see friends the next day, and I'm an adult, and so I could use some top-down regulation and say, maybe I'm a little tired, or because I hadn't slept as well the night before. I've been pretty rested recently, and then I actually wrote in my journal, I said, maybe most of feeling good is being pretty well rested and not in any physical pain. That's a big part of feeling good, is the absence of fatigue and the absence of physical pain. And then I thought, wow, that's just so basic. There's like 2 building blocks. It's clearly insufficient. But then I couldn't think of a word to adequately describe the emotion that came about an hour later when I was feeling a little bit better, but not completely better. So was I lonely? Not really, not anymore. Was I sad? Not really. But, as I headed out into the city, I was thinking, I don't really have a word for how I feel. I'm sort of okay, not great, not low, and so I think that we have emotional labels. I certainly do for, these peak emotional states. Super happy. I loved the time with my sister. We do this every year. This was a particularly good year for us to do this, and it went really well. We were texting back and forth how great it was. I certainly know what it feels like to be really down in the pits. I've got language for that. But then there's this huge range in between. And so I guess the simple question is, should we even trust language as a way to understand how we're feeling? Or are there additional, if not better, signals that we should perhaps learn to elaborate our understanding of emotions with?
So I'm going to give you a simple answer, and then I'm going to give you a more complicated answer.
Great.
So the simple answer is no, language is not sufficient, period. Well, I should say one language is not sufficient. So English is not sufficient, and probably French on its own is not sufficient, and probably Swahili on its own is not sufficient. Although it's very interesting that the states that we mark with words in each culture, some of them overlap, but a lot of them don't. And it's very, very useful to have labels of emotion concepts from other cultures that capture configurations over a state that we don't really mark. We don't mark those and sort of distinctively pull them out as different from other states.
I'd love to know what some of those are.
There are. I should have brought them with me. I mean, there are some, like there's a German word which I can't remember the name of the word, but it's like the experience of someone having a face that deserves a punch.
I'm sure someone will tell us in the comments.
You know,
someone who knows German or spend time there, please put that word in the comments, but don't punch anyone.
Another one that's my favorite is ligut, which is a Polynesian headhunting emotion word, and it means exuberant aggression in a group, like soccer or headhunting. Or I should say also in the military. So when I was listening to these former military personnel talk about being deployed in a war where they're with their buddies and they're basically hunting the enemy, and they feel exuberant. It's not that they're happy, but it's pleasant and it's very intense, very high arousal. And in the moment, it seemed right. And then they come back, their deployment's ended, now they're back home and they're like, am I a psychopath? Like, I enjoy killing people. What is this about? And I was thinking, no, you just experienced ligut. And if you had a word for it, you would understand that it's a groupy feeling where you're all in it together and it's really intense. And you know, they were experiencing the intensity of having their life on the line and being responsible for their brothers, you know, and sisters in their troop. So what they would realize is it's perfectly within the range of normal human variation. It's just that in English, we don't have a word for it, really. But there are words that are concepts in other languages, right? Or the other one that I like is called giggle, which is where when you see a baby who's really cute and you just want to like, oh,
I had that experience yesterday evening.
Just squeeze.
Oh my God, that kid was so cute. His little cheeks are just like jumping at you. And
yeah, you just
and,
want to go, I want to bite you.
And the parents are delightful people too.
Yeah.
And they was just facing out because they had one of those outward-facing baby things.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of like, it's
and I think that
Kegel, it's called?
It's called Giggle.
Giggle. Oh, Kegels is from the other episode that we did on pelvic
well, it
health.
also has to do with babies, but in a different way. Or there's one in Japan. I think there's a Japanese word for the despair that you feel when you got a bad haircut.
Really?
Yeah, because it really is a different kind of feeling than, because you've got to like wait for it to grow, whatever. Anyways, the point being that words for us mark particular states, and they're not always the states that other people in other cultures care about. Even, again, the phrasing of your question, I just want to come back to, and I'm not trying to pick at you, but
feel free.
When we ask questions, any of us, me too, anybody asks a question, there are certain assumptions that we're making in order to allow us to pose the question. And sometimes what I'm taking issue with is not the question itself, but it's the assumptions behind the question. Is language sufficient to label or to gauge emotional states? Kind of sounds like, and this is the assumption that people make, that there's a state in here called an emotion, and now I have to label it. I have to identify it. That is not how it works. Like, that is not what your brain is doing at all. And in order to explain what I think is happening and my best available guess, like based on what I understand, it's like not even remotely, that is just not a meaningful question at all. I do think words are important. I just don't think that they have to be insufficient by virtue of what the brain is actually doing. And the way that I come at this is just really different from a lot of my colleagues. So really for 100 years at least, what psychologists and neuroscientists did and are still doing is they start with a folk experience, a folk category, a common sense experience. I feel angry. I'm making a decision. I'm having a memory. I'm remembering something. They start with their experience, and then they go looking for the physical basis of that experience in the brain or in the body. I think that's really problematic because not everybody in the world actually uses those categories or has those experiences.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the scientific publication process.
For sure.
One of the most important statements I ever heard is from the late Ted Jones, one of the greatest neuroanatomists of probably the last 500 years, which was the following. He said, "A drug is a substance that when injected into an animal or a person produces a scientific paper." And in many
wonderful.
ways, yeah, it kind of gets you square in the face. Can you go, oh, right.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, every drug, if taken an hour or two before sleep, changes the amount of REM sleep that you get. So I could imagine that almost any perturbation of the language system, the body, the facial movement system could give you a quote unquote effect that you could write a paper about.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it has any semblance whatsoever to what's happening in the world when we or other people experience emotions.
We often will identify biological signals by what we believe them to mean psychologically. So serotonin is a happiness chemical. No, serotonin evolved as a metabolic regulator. It is a metabolic regulator. And whatever it's doing, it's allowing an animal to spend resources when the animal's brain isn't sure there's a reward at the end of that, right? So you were saying before, the absence of fatigue, the absence of discomfort, that's a pleasant feeling, right? Well, yeah, so maybe serotonin has something to do with pleasantness because it has something to do with energetics, right? Cortisol is not a stress hormone. It's not a stress hormone. I mean, it's a hormone that is secreted more when the brain believes that there is a big metabolic outlay that's required. That's what stress is, basically. It's the brain believes there's a big metabolic outlay that's about to be required. And it matters. These kind of like little semantic tweaks, like they matter a lot because of how we do research. So I would say I don't start with the categories that derive from English and my own experience. I start with the nervous system. I try to learn what is the best available evidence for how that nervous system evolved, how it developed, how it's structured, right? Anatomy, to me, is very important. Some of my best hypotheses come from just learning the anatomy and realizing, oh, well, there's a connection there. That's direct. That should mean something, I could give you lots of examples of where we've made discoveries solely because we noticed a set of anatomical connections and we're really curious about what they might be involved with. But if you start with that premise, then you think about the brain, and I think about the brain in a really different way, right? So I don't think about the brain as a stimulus-driven organ. I think about it more like this, that first of all, the brain is not running a model or making inferences about the world. All the brain knows are signals from the sensory surfaces of its body. So your brain is modeling your retina, and it's modeling your cochlea, and it's modeling the sensory surfaces of the skin. And sure, signals hit those surfaces, and those surfaces transduce those signals and send them up to the brain. But the brain only knows the body. And anything it knows about the world, it knows about the world through the body, through the sensory surfaces of the body. So that's the first, for me, really big, important point. The second important point is that I think about the brain as being trapped in a dark, silent box called your skull. And it's receiving signals continuously from the sensory surfaces of the body. But those signals are the outcomes of some set of changes. And the brain doesn't know what the changes are. It doesn't know the causes of those signals. It just knows the outcomes. It knows the signals. That's what it's receiving. And so it has to guess at what the causes of those signals are in order to stay alive. And so that's in philosophy called an inverse problem. So the brain just has a massive continuous inverse problem that it has to deal with all the time.
Like it doesn't have access to all the information.
No.
It's just a guessing machine.
It's a guessing machine. So for example, if you hear a loud bang, what is that loud bang? Could be a car door slamming. It could be thunder. It could be a car backfiring. It could be a gunshot. The brain doesn't know. It has to guess. And it's not making a guess like an intellectual guess. The guess is a motor plan. It's a plan for changing the internal state of the body in order to support skeletal motor movements. Do I need to run? Do I need to shut the window? Do I need to get an umbrella? Do I need to hold my breath because a car is backfired? What do I need to do? So where does that plan come from? Well, it comes from past experience, the experience that's been wired into the brain. I think that the evidence suggests that what the brain is doing is basically reinstating bits and pieces of past experience, so remembering, although we don't experience ourselves as remembering, but basically it's re-implementing ensembles of signals from the past that are similar to the present in some way. Now, a bunch of things which are similar to each other in psychology is a category. So what the brain is doing is it's constructing a category. And in fact, we think about the brain as a continuous category constructor. It's constructing a category of possible futures, possible outcomes, possible motor plans. And how does it know which is the right one? Because it's not just picking one. There's going to be some sample that it's re-implementing. But how does it know which is the right one? Because there can only be one.
Well, I feel like in the example of a loud noise, what I immediately thought of as you were describing that is that my system would become aware of it. I would become aware of it. But then it's a question of, is there another loud noise? How closely are those loud noises spaced? Is it getting louder or less loud? And so a bunch of categories, it's like a bookshelf with an infinite number of books. But then with the second loud noise, now it's just, one wing of the library. And then with the next thing that happens and the context, it starts narrowing. And then pretty soon you get presented with the book that says, the roof is about to cave in.
And I think your analogy there is pointing out two things. One is that what the brain is attempting to do is to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty is super expensive. Now, sometimes we deliberately cultivate uncertainty, right? Like we do not, we deliberately try to learn things we don't know. We put ourselves in novel situations, we seek novelty and because it's fun and interesting and whatever, sure. But imagine every single waking moment of your life was like that, where you didn't know, you couldn't narrow things down from the library to the wing, to the bookshelf, to the particular shelf on that bookshelf, to
terrifying.
It would be
terrifying.
Yeah, it would be.
That's the label I would give it.
Yeah.
It would be terrifying.
Right.
Because I couldn't plan anything or do anything because all possibilities are open.
Right. It's just actually metabolically unsustainable. And there are some brains that are wired in a way that they don't predict very well. They don't create these categories very well. And so they're dealing with unbelievable amounts of uncertainty. Part of what's the goal here, if you could say there's a goal, is to reduce uncertainty. And I'm going to get to why this has anything to do with emotion in a minute, but I just need to set up the ground rules or the assumptions that I'm working with here. So the other thing, though, that you pointed out, which I think is really important, is that none of this is static. It's all evolving over time, right? The signals are evolving over time. So both the signals that are constantly hitting the sensory surfaces of the body and making their way to the brain, but also the intrinsic signals in the brain, it's all changing over time. So when we talk about context, that's important. How is the brain making a decision about similarity? Like, what are the features that are similar? It's not just at a single snapshot in time. It's always happening dynamically over time, right? And most of the time, though, you don't wait to hear a second sound. You're not deliberately attempting to figure out what the sound is. Your brain is just sorting it out, right? And it's sorting it out by narrowing down the possibilities. And there are some selection mechanisms in the brain that help it guess better. But also the signals coming from the world are also helping to select which possibility is the right one.
There's this scene that comes to mind from that movie, I think it was Saving Private Ryan, where the guys that are about to hit the ground on D-Day are flinching with every crack of gunfire. Like everything's a stimulus to move and to end. And then some of the more seasoned soldiers are literally having bullets whizzing by their head and people are dropping dead all around them and they're moving forward steely-eyed and stable and upright. And in part, we look at that and say, okay, they're courageous, they're seasoned, maybe they're desensitized in certain ways, but actually it fits much better with the idea, based on what you're saying, it fits much better with the idea that they have intimate knowledge, both conscious and unconscious knowledge, that something right next to them is a threat, but not a threat worth responding to.
Right, exactly.
But if it were headed straight for them, they would quite understand.
What I would say is that it's not. I keep referring to things as signals, and really, that's like my generic word for a quantity of energy of some sort. But your brain, my brain, every brain is constantly making signal, noise, distinctions. Do I need to care about this? Do I not need to care about this? Right? And we have ways of learning, and we also have ways of cueing each other. So, humans use eye gaze to cue each other about what is signal and what is noise, right? So if you and I are sitting, let's say we were at a coffee shop and we were in a part of town that I had never been to before, and we were sitting having coffee, and, a loud siren went by. If you turned and looked, I would probably turn and look because you just cued me that was something I need to care about. If you ignored it, I would probably ignore it because you just cued me that I didn't need to worry about it. I didn't need to care. And we're constantly doing that with each other. And we also do it with little babies and with kids. And that's how we teach children. This is signal. This is noise. This you need to worry about. This you can ignore. And so, your description is perfect. So what does this have to do with emotion? So, okay, you've got these signals. The brain has these electrical signals going on. We'll just ignore the hormonal signals for the moment because that's complicated. One is complicated. So it's got all these electrical signals going on. When it's remembering something, it's just basically reinstating a pattern of signals. And it's got these signals coming in from the sensory surfaces. It's a signal processor. So what is it? I don't mean a computer. I mean a signal processor in the engineering sense. So what is it doing? It's assembling a set of features. Some of the features that it's assembling are very close in detail to the sensory surfaces of the body. So in primary visual cortex, there's a retinotopic map. The details there are very, very low level, like a line, an edge, Same thing in primary auditory cortex, right? It's tonotopic, so there are tones. But it's very, very, very low level details. There are many, 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 many of these little features. So we would say it's a high dimensional array, lots and lots and lots and lots of features. And let's just talk about one structure, just the cerebral cortex. Let's not worry about but what I'm about to say is basically true of really the rest of the brain as well. If you take the cortex off the surface, the cortical sheet off that wavy, cortical sheet, you take it off the rest of the brain, the subcortical parts, and you stretch it out like a napkin, you can see there's a compression gradient there in the architecture of the neurons. So at the primary sensory areas, there are these tiny little pyramidal neurons that are representing these very low-level features. And they feed into bigger neurons, which feed into bigger neurons, which feed into more bigger neurons. So what's happening is you've got this very detailed array being compressed in its dimensionality until you get to the middle of the brain at the front, where there are many fewer neurons, but they're bigger and they have many more connections. So it's a dimensionality reduction that's happening.
So just to make sure I understand correctly and that the audience understands, the physical world obviously is transformed by our sensory apparatus, the retina, the cochlea, the sensing neurons in our skin.
Yeah.
It's physical things, mechanical pressure, light, photons, sound waves. Okay, that's translated into neural code, which is chemical and electrical.
Yeah.
And those sensory inputs are fairly vast, and you call it high dimensionality. So lots of different orientations of lines. Even though it originates with just 3 cone photopigments, lots of opportunity for encoding different shades of color, contrast, and all of that. And so you have lots of little neurons to represent all the possibilities of the physical world that are occurring.
Mm-hmm.
But as that information is passed further up along, you have to be careful with the use of hierarchies because that's controversial nowadays, not for political reasons, but for accuracy reasons. As that information is passed along, there's more convergence onto a smaller number of larger neurons. So these are neurons that have access to a lot of information, but in coarser form.
Right. So they're low, it's like compressing an MP3, like how an MP3 compresses information, for example. So the cortex is representing features. So, and I'm just using that in a generic way because that's also controversial about exactly how is the brain. Okay, but yeah.
But it works.
But for now, I'm using it just in a generic way. So you go from lines and edges to a shape, like a round shape, to a face, to right. So you're basically you're going. What's happening is there are summaries of summaries of summaries of summaries.
I love that. I hope everyone hears that because I've been in this field of neuroscience a long time. As you move along the neuraxis from the sensory epithelium, now it sounds very, very nomenclature-ish, but from the surface of the skin inward, you're getting summaries.
Yeah.
Send more and more summaries. I think that's so important. That's a like a gazillion-dollar statement.
Thank you.
For understanding of the nervous system.
So, but at each of those points correspond to some mental feature, like a line or an edge, or a circle, or a square, or a face, or right. But now, then when you're in the midline at the front, what are those features? Well, those features are things like they are multimodal summaries, meaning they are summaries of the sights and sounds and smells and right, but they are lower dimensional, meaning they're coarser. So there are things like threat, reward, pleasure. I mean, really abstract. That's what abstract means. It doesn't mean that those representations have no sensory or motor meaning. It means that threat, for example, a summary, can have many different patterns associated with it. And the brain is treating them all as equivalent.
This to me, again, feels so important for people to understand because as I'm hearing this and this word summaries is just ringing in my mind, it's so important because one of the core components of my experience of my emotions, because that's all I can really say for sure, my subjective interpretation and labeling of my own emotions is that they are pretty broad bins, like I described earlier.
They are pretty broad bins. And so that's where I was exactly where I was going. So what about the word anger? Where is that represented? Like, well, that's one of these multimodal abstractions. In fact, anger is just a couple of phonemes. It's a couple of sounds. But those sounds, the sound of anger corresponds over thousands of instances that you've learned in your life to very different patterns of sensory motor features. That's right, because what's going on in your body during anger can vary. The way you move your face in anger can vary depending on the situation. What you see someone else doing in anger can vary. And so the word anger, or any word, is actually just a multimodal summary of many, 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 many instances, which are in their sensory and motor features, the sensory and motor meaning, very different.
And it seems to me are highly constrained by developmental and cultural experience.
Absolutely.
Because just today I learned that there's a word in Japan for the feeling that one has of having gotten a haircut they don't like. There's a word in Germany that pertains to the feeling of wanting to punch someone specifically because of the look on their face.
Well, really, it's more to you, it feels like they're asking to be punched in the face.
Even so, you added yet more dimensionality to it. So upon learning just those things just today, there is additional dimensionality brought in such that if I were to ever want to punch somebody in the face simply because of the look on their face, that I wouldn't necessarily label that as anger alone. It now has another dimension to it. And so I think I'm finally starting to understand how the developmental and the cultural influences, plus the fact that language is a pretty crude descriptor for this neural process that you're describing.
Oh, it's absolutely. But okay, but before you use the word granularity, and so I'm going to use that word too. In fact, I've coined that phrase, emotional granularity. Just as an aside, I coined that phrase almost 30 years ago, and now people study it like it's a phenomenon, which is cool in a sense. But also I kind of want to keep reminding them, like, that's a word that refers to a process. It's not a thing, it's a process. But the process is, so when the brain is a category constructor, how fine-grained are the categories? How precise are the categories, right? Like, if your feature of equivalence that your brain is using is threat, you're in really big trouble. Because there are like a gazillion different sensory motor patterns that could go with threat. So your category is going to be massive. So how does the brain figure out which of those massive number of options is the one to use in this instance? If, on the other hand, you don't just want to use sensory motor patterns as the features of equivalence or the features that you're using to say this instance right now is similar to these past instances. If I had to search, like right now, what is similar to right now, it would be me sitting across the table from somebody who has a beard and is dressed in black. And, there are a lot of details there that probably don't matter, right? So you'd be searching for a specific match from the past. That's not very efficient either. So you need something in the middle. And that is to say, you need to have, your brain has to be able to make categories that are more fine-grained, but not super fine-grained. But they have to be more fine-grained than just threat.
Yeah, you want to keep in the library analogy that I made earlier, you want to keep the rest of the library accessible at some level.
Yeah.
So you're not just staring at that one book.
But if you use the category bad, this feels bad, then your brain is basically going to be partially constructing an entire wing full of books, like an entire wing full of options. If you use the word angry, then maybe it's a bookcase. It's constructing a bookcase full of options and a category that's the size of a bookcase. And if you were using the word frustrated, then maybe it's a shelf. The brain can learn to construct categories at different scales of generalizability. So if I'm in an instance and my brain is making a guess, is it drawing from past instances that were associated with the word anger? Were associated with the word fear? Maybe it's some combination. The words are just features. They're just sounds. There are also all sorts of other features, like what was my heart doing? What kind of motor actions did I make? What did I see next? So the point being, what I'm trying to bring here is that it's not like your brain creates an emotional state and then labels it. What your brain is doing is creating a category of possible futures of what it's going to do next. And that state is largely determined by what the brain is remembering and how it's drawing from that huge population, that huge library of options. Which books is it sampling?
I love this so much because it's clear to me, just based on my experience today of hearing these words from other cultures that relate to different emotional states, that this system, unlike a lot of systems in the brain, I like to think is fairly plastic.
Yeah.
Like the moment that you know that there are additional dimensions to sadness, anger, etc., there's something comforting about that. What's really unsettling is the idea that we have such broad bins that we would define, a near infinite number of situations as just fear. That would suck. That's not a good existence.
If you look through even just the last, 100 or so years, like the 19th, 20th centuries, maybe, you can see that the complexity of people's responses expands and contracts. Authoritarian thinking is the reduction of complexity to some things that are really, really simple. Like you're getting rid of all the complexity to, basically these very, very coarse, low-dimensional judgments. things become black and white. It's the avoidance of complexity so that there can be simple, single answers to things. And it happens in human culture at times, and then there's an expansion of complexity at times too. So what predicts that? Like, what is it in the human nervous system or our collective human nervous, like we're just a bunch of brains attached to bodies interacting with other brains and bodies, right? So like, what is it that causes these ripples of, and I have some thoughts about that are really, really, really speculative. But I think the other thing that's really important is that we've talked about, so we'll go back to our cortical sheath and by the way, this is just one compression gradient in the brain. There are others too, right? There are at least 4 others that I can think of. So this is just one. But all compression gradients work the same way, which is that now we've talked about going from the low-level details, compressing to these multimodal summaries, these really like simple features that are, right? But that compression is what engineers would call lossy, meaning you lose the information. You lose the information. So when you go from lines and edges to a face, those neurons, they just know the face. They lose what they've thrown away, the details they've thrown away, those details are gone for those neurons that are representing a face.
They don't have access to that.
They don't have access to it. So we said, well, the brain is making a guess. It's making a guess about what this big, very, very high dimensional, soup of signals in the world and in the body, like what do they mean, right? When the brain makes a guess, it starts with the compressed low dimensional signals. It starts with the features like anger or like threat, or it starts with these summaries, and then it has to infer or guess. At every synapse, there's a guess that's being made about what the details are at the next level. Because what's happening is the guess is basically the brain going from these really general things to these very specific sensory motor patterns. It happens along the cortical sheath. It happens also down the neuraxis, down the nerve, from the cortex to the midbrain to the brainstem to the spinal cord. You have to go from a representation of, run to the actual physical movements of muscles, spindles, and, angles of joints and things like that. So what you're doing is you're going in the other direction. You're adding detail, you're particularizing, and the brain is guessing. It's guessing, well, if it's using anger as the general feature, well, which instance of anger is it? And what are the specifics that are going to happen? And
what are and forgive me, but what are the adaptive steps that I might take or not take? Because I'm quoting a lot today, so forgive me, but in the words of the great Sherrington, Nobel Prize-winning physiologist, the final common pathway is movement.
And that's
and movement is nuanced, right? Humans, yeah. I suppose, have among the greatest variety of different speeds and types of movement. I think about parkour or gymnastics. Think about then what like a cheetah can do. Cheetahs are impressive. A gymnast is truly impressive in terms of the range of movements and speeds, et cetera. In any event, the ultimate choice that the nervous system has to make is whether or not to move, which direction, how fast, or stay still, move forward, move back. And I'll just add, because I'm hoping that you'll expand on this. It's been said before that ultimately the nervous system is trying to make decisions about yum, yuck, or meh. Like am I going to move towards something? Am I going to move away from it? Or am I just going to stay put?
Well, that's only at that's a very, I would say that those are very low dimensional features. So those are those compressed features, but that's not the only thing the brain has to decide. That's just a misnomer.
Well, I can get out of this little pickle that I just put myself in by saying that I didn't say that.
No, I know.
And now I won't quote who did, because he's a very famous neuroscientist. No. But he tried to reduce it all. He's at Caltech. He's not somebody who studies emotion. He studies the visual system. But he said that that there's that the neural circuits, maybe it's because he studies mice, are essentially binned into yum, yuck, and meh outputs. And I've always liked it on the one hand because threes work and it's simple, but rarely is the way that we describe things the way it actually works.
So we would, in studying humans, we would say, well, that's affect. Affect, that's mood. Or, it's just like, is it should I move towards it? Is it pleasant? Should I move away from it? Is it unpleasant? Or, is it irrelevant, basically? Like, I don't care. Okay, think about when you're feeling horrible. You feel bad. Mm-hmm. What do?
You don't know what
you don't know because you don't have a plan of action. And that's ultimately, that is what those compressed, like summary features, those very low coarse features, they have to be decompressed into details. Otherwise, you don't know what to do. So ultimately, what the brain is doing is it's sampling from the past based on similarity to the present to plan an action. And when I say action, I don't just mean skeletal motor action, like moving a limb. The first actions that are planned are the actions of coordinating the heart and the lungs and, all of the internal actions that are required to support the skeletal motor movements. So your brain is categorizing, and it's making it's creating a category, and there are options there. Those options, the motor plans begin with, should the heart beat faster? Should it beat slower? Does blood pressure need to go up? Should the blood vessels constrict or should they dilate? Should the breathing be deeper or more shallow? I mean, those are the first plans that get made. And then milliseconds later, there are the skeletal motor plans. And then your experience of the world derives from those motor plans. Those visceromotor, that is the plans for the viscera, for the internal organs, and the skeletal motor, so I'm just going to refer to them as motor. Those motor plans actually give rise to your experience of the world. There's not some state that exists as an emotional state, which then you apply a label to. The label is just a set of features that are useful for generalizing from the past to the present. And the bin size, or of what a word refers to, can change. It can change. It's different for different people, and it can change in your lifetime. And you can add new bins. That is, so for example, there's a concept, güskenlük, which I probably just butchered. So if you speak Turkish, I'm sorry. But it's like, it has features of like loss and like people blocking your goals. So we would say it's anger and sadness together. That's güskenlük. When you lose something and you're pissed off about it. That's a category on its own, right? It's just a different way of parsing that really detailed soup. And the more words you know, the more words are just useful for pointing to a set of features that are similar to each other. So what I mean by that is, if I say to you, Andrew, I had pizza last night for dinner. Pizza, 2 sounds, 2 syllables. Those 2 syllables, they stand in for like 50 different sensory and motor features. Because I don't have to say to you, I had a food, I didn't have pizza last night, but let's say I did. I had a food that was round and flat and had sauce and also cheese, and it had mozzarella cheese and also a little Parmesan cheese, and it had mushrooms on it and a little bit of olive, and that's like really, really detailed and complicated. But instead, I can just say I had pizza, 2 features, 2 sounds, 2 syllables, phonemes. And with those 2 phonemes, I have just communicated to you in your brain. My brain had 50 features it was representing of details, and now I have just communicated those to you, or some number of them, with 2 sounds. Very efficient. Now, of course, you might think that I was from Chicago and had deep dish pizza. And I'll just resist. I don't want to offend anybody from Chicago. But
it's not pizza.
That's not real pizza. That's not real pizza. Right? So you could then ask me, was it, but you're from Chicago, is that deep dish pizza? And then I would say, no, I'm actually from Toronto, which is just like New York. And so no, it was thin crust pizza, which is really the only kind of pizza there is. Just saying. But my point is that words are just low-dimensional features, these sort of gross features that stand in for many, 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 many little detailed features. And that's how we communicate with each other.
And we are constrained by, what we know and our
yes.
And what we can say and the extent of our vocabulary. I want to ask whether or not we can take this incredible understanding of emotions, because that's really what we're talking about.
Well, we're really talking about my version of how the brain works and how emotions emerge out of this system.
And anchor that to this concept of movement, that the movement is the final common path, with the understanding that the movement system, and forgive me, systems, plural, that they run in both directions. In other words, how we feel, what we feel, our emotions has some bearing on the movements that are more or less likely for us in a given context. And our movements clearly can also influence the way that we feel internally.
Well, here's what the anatomy tells us. When the brain makes a guess, that guess starts as a motor plan. It starts as a visceral motor plan and a skeletal motor plan.
So heart rate changes, breathing changes, blood pressure changes, and potentially skeletal muscle movement.
Right. And literal copies, efferent copies of those signals are they propagate to the sensory areas, telling those neurons, the last time in this context, when this other stuff just happened and we made these movements, here's what we saw next, here's what we felt next, here's what we smelled next. Your brain conjures an experience, okay? And that experience is that you see something, you feel something, you act. That's not what's happening. What's happening is your brain is preparing the action first, and the feeling and your experience comes from that action preparation. So it's a copy. It's like literally you have axons that are sending motor signals down the brainstem to the spinal cord, and literal copies of those axons. Like those axons have branches, that collateral branches that just send axons other places. The same signal that is being sent to your spinal cord to move stuff in your body, that same signal is being sent to other neurons in the brain as predictions of the sensations that are going to happen in a second from now, a moment from now, probably faster than a second, but in a couple milliseconds, if you move. And so, yes, it is the case that what you feel is linked to what you do, and what you do is linked to what you feel, but not in this simple mechanistic way that neuroscientists and psychologists have been using forever. It's not like you're probed by a stimulus. You see something, you hear something, and then you process it and evaluate it, and then you react to it. No, that's not what's happening. What's actually happening under the hood is that based on how things are right now, your brain makes a guess or some guesses, and those guesses start as motor plans. And the consequence of those motor plans are predicted sensations. And then, of course, sensory signals are coming from the sensory surfaces, and here's to me the most mind-boggling thing about this whole explanation. If your sensory neurons in your sensory areas are already, so they're firing, the action potentials, the spiking has changed based on these prepared motor movements. So these are sensory predictions. And, when I give talks and on my website, I have some cool examples of how this works. You can experience it yourself. You start to experience, you hear things that aren't there. You feel vibrations in your chest that aren't there because your brain is predicting. It's predicting these sensations. So let's say the sensations come, the sensory signals, I should say. Let me say. So the sensory signals from the sensory surfaces of the body make it to the brain. If your neurons are already firing in a way to anticipate those signals just confirm the firing, and then they're done. They don't make it any further into the brain. So when you're predicting well, your experience is constructed completely by your brain. The signals from the sensory surfaces are there just to confirm or to change the signals. So if there's things you didn't anticipate, then those errors of prediction, those are the signals that are propagated and become compressed and stuff. And we have a special name for that in science. We call it learning. Andy Clark is a philosopher who writes a lot about predicting brain and so on. And he talks about normal everyday experience as being a controlled hallucination.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I subscribe to that. It's a fairly adaptive in most circumstances, controlled hallucination, but it has its limitations. And what we were talking about, if I could be somewhat of a summary neuron, you can tell me if my summary is too coarse, is that, first of all, that the neural systems and the brain, let's just call it the nervous system, because we're talking about brain and body, are incredibly dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of inputs. Those inputs are incredibly elaborate. They get summarized. The summary prepares the body for a certain action. That's a motor commands, a premotor commands, and then some action may or may not be taken. But already, as soon as an action is taken or not taken, the whole state of the neural system is different. It's changed as a consequence of what just happened. Now, of course, when people hear that, and when I hear that, indeed, I feel like, wow, it's a tough system to study because these are dynamical neural systems, and we have the technology to put people in functional scanners and look at what lights up, so to speak. We have the capacity to ask people how they feel based on questionnaires, but you can imagine that's incredibly crude. So then you give them Likert scales of, rate from 1 to 10 how happy or sad you are. And so you're adding some depth and dimensionality to it, but it's incredibly crude. It's nothing like real experience. And if somebody's more verbal, less verbal, maybe they somaticize more or less. An example comes to mind that, occasionally you learn from social media, which often I learn from social media. And someone once said, I don't think in thoughts, I think in feels. And I thought, okay, great. You're probably also from Northern California. And then I said, wait, Andrew, stop being so judgmental. What do you mean? And I asked, and they said, I experience emotions in their mind first as a bodily state, then the label comes much later. That's not how it works for me. It feels fairly more integrated, brain and body for me. But other people started chiming in, no, I think of emotion, I experience emotions clearly as a verbal label. It's all in their head. And so you start to realize that we might all be encoding the world slightly differently or very differently, and it's changing in time. So then the question becomes, what are the anchor points in terms of our understanding of emotions that we can work with? And the following questions come to mind. Neither you nor I are clinicians, as far as I know. I'm certainly not.
I was actually trained as a clinician.
Oh, there you go. I'm wrong again.
But I haven't. No. But I haven't practiced in really gazillions of years.
Okay. Well, you're more than qualified to answer the question I'm about to ask, which is, to me, there is a great conflict of information in the psychology, psychiatry, and let's just call it wellness and mental health space, which is when we are feeling lousy, like not good, let's put valence on it, just lousy, I don't want, in a state that we're having an emotion that we don't want to have. There's an entire category of information that says you need to feel your feelings. You need to feel your feelings. You need to acknowledge that they're there. You need to go into the feeling, maybe even full catharsis. You need to amplify the feelings until they, quote unquote, leave your body. After all, Steve Jobs was into scream therapy and he helped him expunge his anger. Who knows? You get these examples. He's probably the worst example because it seemed like he was angry a lot from what I hear. But then there's another category of thought, which is, no, you need to use your ability to top-down control, inhibition of the cortex on lower structures. Again, I'm deliberately using crude language here to say, wait, this is an emotion. Emotions pass. This is not real. This is just a limited set of high dimensionality stuff that's been summarized. And you know what? I don't need to feel this way. I can make myself feel differently. Maybe I'll go for a run. In fact, I always feel better after I go for a run. So even this question as simple as, should we feel our feelings or should we not feel our feelings? And of course, you would hope that this would be answered appropriately such that people don't go harm other people or themselves.
Sure.
But assuming that they're not going to harm other people or themselves, verbally or physically, then you really get yourself into a bit of a pickle. We don't understand what to do with emotions, ours or other people's, because clearly we don't understand emotions per se.
So I would say, I'm going to answer your question, and then I want to also pick at I want to pick at an assumption because it's come up actually a couple of times, and there's something super important in your descriptions that I just want to pull out for the listeners because I think it's really important. And you're doing it very naturally, but I think some people, it just bears commenting on. So let me just deal with the question of, should we feel our feelings or use our words? We say to little kids, use your words, like don't throw a tantrum, right? But then there was also this other feeling, well, just feel, it's important to feel, and you don't want to have it be pent up, and
or
this
use your body and hit a pillow.
Yeah.
I mean, there's scream therapy, bite the pillow, scream the pillow, tear the pillow.
Yeah.
I mean, you can pay $5,000 for a week of doing this, and they'll tell you you're going to feel better at the end.
So
right?
The answer there is it's the wrong question. Like flexibility is important for everything always, right? So first of all, you don't have emotions in your body. Your body doesn't keep the score, Yeah,
great book title because it's super catchy.
Yeah.
But with all due respect to, I think, the important work of Van der Kolk, I think it oversimplified and led people to believe that their back pain was trauma and that all trauma is somaticized. And it's not.
No, it's not. But I would go further and say, first of all, your body doesn't keep the score. Your brain keeps the score. Your body is the scorecard. That's super important. And he has done really important work. But his explanations for why things work is scientifically incorrect. It just is. Because we don't feel things in our bodies. Everything we feel in our brains. We don't see in our eyes, we see in our brains. Of course, we need our eyes, but we don't see in our eyes. Just like if you pinch your hand with, take skin and pinch between, two fingers, the skin, you don't feel that actually in your hand, you feel it in your brain. That's the magic of the brain in a sense. So what I would say is it depends on the situation and what your goal is. Sometimes it is useful to use your words, and sometimes it is useful to go for a run. It just depends on what your goal is.
Well, in both those cases, that you gave, both those examples, it's a way of shifting off the emotion. I guess what I'm asking is,
sometimes you don't want to shift off the emotion. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the wisest thing to do is live in the emotion. That is, sometimes discomfort, sometimes when something feels bad, it doesn't mean something is wrong. It just might mean that you're doing something hard.
Well, earlier I wrote, when you were talking about the broad categorization of emotions, I wrote down, simple is good when it feels good. You're like, I just feel really great. But then when things feel lousy, that's where nuance could be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Because emotions are recipes for action. When you go from feeling bad to feeling angry or sad, it's a recipe for action. The prediction error, the things that the brain doesn't predict, are teaching signals. And I think it's true also in your life. Sometimes you want to feel it. You want to feel the discomfort because it's instructive about something. And sometimes it's not. And maybe that's not really an answer, but the only way that you can figure that out for yourself is to do it sometimes. If you're always getting rid of discomfort, you never know when it's useful. And it is useful sometimes. But now I want to get to this point that I was making before. We are talking about feeling and emotion they're interchangeable. And they're not, right? So here's how I would say it. Your brain is always regulating your body 24/7. And your body is always sending sensory signals back to the brain about the sensory state of the body. And our nervous systems aren't wired for us to experience those sensory changes that are happening in the body in any degree of detail. We're just not. And it's a good thing. Right now, as we talk here, our hearts are beating and our, pancreas is squishing stuff out, liver is, filtering and oxygen concentrations are changing. There's a whole drama going on inside each of us and our listeners. And we're not aware. And I hope our listeners aren't aware, because if they were, they would not be listening to anything we were saying. They'd be completely, enraptured or in discomfort at what's going on inside them. Instead, the brain creates a low-dimensional summary, this gross kind of like barometer, which is feeling, affective feeling, we call it, or you could call it mood, but scientists call it affect with an A. Feeling pleasant, feeling unpleasant, feeling worked up, feeling calm, feeling comfortable, feeling uncomfortable. It's kind of a general barometer of the state of the body. And it's not emotion. Those feelings, those features of feeling are features of consciousness because your brain is always regulating your body. Your body's always sending signals back to the brain. The brain is always representing them in this low dimensional way, whether you're paying attention or not, like whether the brain is focusing, it's, applying attention to those neurons or not, those signals are there. And even when we're not emotional, like if you're driving on the highway and somebody cuts you off and you think, what an asshole, the assholeness of that person, that intensity of that negative affect is you experience it as a property of that person. But really it's coming from you. It's not a property of that person. That's a feature of your experience in that moment. And affect is always there. Sometimes it's in the foreground, sometimes it's in the background, but it's always there. And it's a summary of physical things, which is why it helps if you take ibuprofen or Tylenol, it will reduce, studies show it reduces negative feeling. If you go for a run, if you go for a walk, if you shift your attention to the outside world, then the features of experience that are derived from the inside world diminish. That's why going for a run helps, or going for a walk helps, or, getting sleep helps, right? These are all things where you're changing the state of your body. And so the sensory state of your body is changing. And so your affect changes. But emotions are the story that the brain tells about what caused the sensory signals that affect derives from. So what caused those changes? What do I need to do about those changes? That's like it's a much bigger event than just these features of experience, which are all features of consciousness, which are always there. They're always there. And in fact, in our culture, we pathologize people when they just experience their bodies as physical sensations and not as emotions. Like we say, oh, that person is so much somaticizing or somatizing. They're not. They should be experiencing emotion, but really they're just experiencing a stomach ache, and that's bad. But that's actually a judgment call that is probably sometimes wrong. Sometimes it's probably better to experience a stomach ache. Sometimes it's more productive. Part of being emotionally intelligent is knowing when not to construct an emotion. Right before the COVID pandemic was announced officially, I was in New Zealand giving talks. And my daughter, who was in college at that time, was flying less than a week before the pandemic was announced. She got on a plane and she flew to New Zealand to meet me. And I remember really vividly, I got on the phone to my husband and I said, I'm experiencing a very high level of arousal and it's very, very unpleasant. Now, my husband knows me very well. And he said, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I said, I know. Now, he didn't say to me, well, you're anxious and you just don't really know it. Because I wasn't anxious. I was feeling uncertain. And as you know, or maybe people know, that when there's a lot of uncertainty, there's also a lot of arousal because the brain is attempting to learn. And the neuromodulators that are important for learning new things happen to also cause a subjective sense of arousal. And they actually also modulate your autonomic nervous system, so your heart can beat faster and whatever. And our go-to explanation for what that is to experience that arousal as anxiety. But I was uncertain. And remember that how your brain, the story it's telling itself, the category it's making, is a plan for action. Well, what do you do in anxiety and fear? You freeze or you run away. What do you do in uncertainty? You forage for information. You tolerate the discomfort and you forage for information, which is what I was doing when I called and said, what should we do? Should I meet her at the airport and turn around and come back? Or should we have a vacation? Like, I don't really know. And, what I ended up doing was foraging for information for another couple days and then made a split-second decision in the air when we were flying from one island to the other, and I just rerouted us and we went home. And then the borders closed like 2 days later, But my point is that this is not just, psychological mumbo jumbo. You can train yourself to experience your heart pounding in your chest as determination. When my daughter, this is all in How Emotions Are Made, these examples, but they're true. I mean, my daughter, this is this book I wrote a couple of years ago. When my daughter was 12 years old, she was testing for a black belt in karate. She was 5 feet tall, not even, and she was testing against these like massively large adolescent boys, okay, who were like a foot taller than her. And her sensei, who was a 10th degree black belt, didn't say to her, "Don't be afraid." He said, "Get your butterflies flying in formation." And I was like enraptured. I was like, oh my God, this guy is totally brilliant. That is the best, meaning to give to arousal that changes the meaning of it. What you do when you create an emotion is you're giving meaning to those affective feelings. And you have more control than you might think in how you do that. You can do it by changing the physical state that gives rise to those feelings, but you can also change it by learning more how to make more categories and how to make them more fluidly so that you do something different. It's not that things will necessarily feel any less unpleasant or any more pleasant. It's that the feeling becomes a source of wisdom. It's a cue to do something different.
So I'd like to ask you more about this word affect. And then I'd like to discuss how things that we do or don't do might be useful for putting us in broad categories of affect so that we might experience particular arrays of emotions. So this is my attempt to understand affect in an effort to think about some actionable items.
Absolutely.
I love the word affect, the way you described it, as we're setting up a potential or a series of potentialities for different emotions to occur. I make it a point to get sunlight in my eyes in the morning to try and wake up my brain and body, because indeed it does that. Broadly speaking, I make an effort to get good sleep at night because that makes everything better.
Absolutely.
And when I'm not sleeping well or enough, it makes everything worse. This is non-clinical, non-nuanced language. But I think most people, when they hear affect and they think about the examples I just gave, kind of understand, like when a kid is tired, a young kid, they get cranky. When we're sleep deprived, we get cranky. Indeed, there are times when I'm sleep deprived and little things grate on me. They're like a splinter just feels super annoying and maybe even painful. But when I'm well rested, things are going better. It's not that bad. So tell us more about affect, because I think it's a really important anchor point for us to understand emotions in ourselves and other people.
Neuroscientists think about the sensory systems for touch and proprioception, which we call somatosensation, as being in the service of skeletal motor movements. Our sense of touch and even vision actually also works this way. And actually audition does too. These senses actually serve in the brain's ability to control the movements of the body. And the same thing is true for regulating the systems of the body. So brains, one of their fundamental jobs are to coordinate and regulate the systems inside your body, your heart, your lungs, your gut, all the moving parts. And the information, the sensory signals that those organs and tissues and so on send back to the brain, those sensory signals are important to the brain's ability to regulate the body, but we don't feel them directly. We usually experience them as affective feelings, these very simple physical sorts of feelings. And then we elaborate them in various ways. When they get very intense, those are the moments when the brain creates emotion out of them. So the brain's regulation of the body, the predictive regulation of the body, is the technical term is allostasis. But when I'm explaining this to the public, I use a metaphor. And, all metaphors are wrong, but some metaphors are less wrong and useful. So the metaphor that I use is your brain is running a budget for your body. And it's not budgeting money, it's budgeting glucose and salt and oxygen and water and all the nutrients that you need to stay alive and well. And so you can think about withdrawals from that budget, like burning glucose or using up oxygen. You can think about deposits, like sleeping and eating. You can think about, savings. So when you're with a friend who you trust and, everything you do actually is just slightly less metabolically expensive, right? And you can also think about taxes. Like if you are stressed, socially stressed within 2 hours of eating a meal, that same meal will cost you the equivalent of 104 more calories in the inefficiency that you will metabolize it because of that stress.
Meaning you'll burn more energy.
You'll be more inefficient in metabolizing the food. So it's as if you had eaten 104 more calories.
Oh, so I had it exactly backwards.
And so over the course of a year, that's 11 pounds.
So when we say that people are taxing on us,
yeah, it's literally true.
Their language works.
Yeah,
their language works.
So the way I describe it is that you can think about affect as a quick and dirty summary of the state of your body budget. If things are going reasonably well, then you'll feel okay. You might even feel pleasant. If you're running a deficit in your body budget, then you're going to feel fatigued or distressed. And that doesn't mean something is necessarily wrong. Like, for example, when you exercise, you get to a certain point where you've reached your ventilatory load. Usually it's 20 minutes in or 10 minutes in or whatever, depending on how hard you're working, and you start to feel unpleasant and fatigued. But that doesn't mean that something's wrong. That just means that you're working really hard and you have to push through it. And then, when you're, drink water and, you eat afterwards and replenish, and then you're fine, right? In fact, you're better. It's a way of building a better, stronger future you. So affect is basically, when you're feeling really worked up, it probably means that something's uncertain somewhere. So I just think about these as like quick and dirty ways of thinking about what your affect means. And then oftentimes, as we've said before, emotion regulation that is controlling emotion really actually is not so much about changing the meaning of affect, it's changing the affect. So it's useful to understand that affect is tied to the state of your body, or actually what it's tied to is your brain's beliefs about the state of your body. Your brain is modeling the state of the body, and that's interoception. That's the technical word. Interoception is not your awareness of your body. It's your brain's modeling of your body, what your brain believes to be true about the metabolic state of your body. And that's how I think about affect. That's how I think about my own affect. And my daughter actually, who was depressed so I should say depression is like a bankrupt body budget. Like you just can't move. You feel fatigued, so fatigued that you can't move and you're very distressed. It's like bankruptcy. And actually, depression is a metabolic illness. And if you look at the symptoms of depression, they really are about metabolic having metabolic deficits, basically.
And it's interesting that one of the hallmark features of depression, subjectively speaking, is a lack of positive anticipation about the future, which makes perfect sense from the perspective of a depleted brain-body budget.
Yes, exactly. You're basically, think about the fact that prediction error, right? So if you're feeling unpleasant, you're not going to be anticipating pleasant things. And even if those things that are in the world could give you pleasure, you won't notice them because learning from prediction error, things that you didn't predict, is expensive. And if you don't have the resources, you're not going to, right? So but anyways, my daughter came up with this, after we had this very interesting thing that happened to us on another trip. We were in Sweden because I was giving a keynote at the Karolinska Institute, and I took her to Sweden, and this is when she was recovering from depression. And she is just one of the millions of young adults who, adolescents and young adults who were experiencing depression. And we got to Sweden, and she was very, very jet lagged. We both were. It was like one of these, we had to, planes, trains, and automobiles. It was just, getting there. And she woke up the next morning, and she looked horrible. She felt horrible. It actually seemed to me like she was about to enter another depressive episode. And I said to her, I basically got her out of bed. I fed her a meal. I gave her 4 ibuprofen, and I put her back to sleep. And she got up 5 hours later, and she was absolutely fine. Her mood was fine. Now, I'm not telling you that ibuprofen is an antidepressant that you should take if you're depressed. But what I'm telling you is that, you said something, Andrew, that was so interesting. At the beginning, you said, am I fatigued? Do I have pain somewhere? Is my body hurt? Right. When basically what she was having was, she was fatigued, and she was having what I would call, the technical word is visceral nociception, which means her stomach hurt, everything hurt. And sure, her muscles probably hurt too, but it was really her innards. Really, she just was distressed. And the ibuprofen helped her get back to sleep, and then she slept, and she got up, and she was completely fine. And then we walked around Stockholm for the rest of the day talking about this experience, which for her was like flipping on a light switch. How Emotions Are Made, this book that I've referred to, I wrote that book for her. I wrote that book for her, but also for me, because it was a way of putting down on paper all the things that I wanted her to know, and that I thought other people should know about their kids, and maybe even their kids could read it. But what she did with that was she came up with a new concept called the emotional flu. And the emotional flu is when you're having a bad body budgeting day, and you're just like, you didn't get enough sleep maybe, or, there's some stress at work or at school that you can't get rid of otherwise. My husband likes to say, well, other people's opinions of you are just electrical activity in somebody's head, which I love. That's just another way of categorizing it. It's sort of like taking apart the cup into pieces of light, right? And so, whatever, there are just these moments where you feel depleted, and you could use we often use affect as a indicator of how the world is. If I feel bad, something must be wrong in the world. But you have to resist that sometimes, because sometimes there's nothing wrong in the world. It's just that you didn't get enough sleep, or, you need to have a little bit more, protein, or maybe you haven't gone for a walk and you're stiff or whatever. You need to do some stretching.
Are those, sorry to interrupt, but I think people are going to want to anchor to a few of these positive steps that they can take to I don't want to say replenish, but to shift affect in positive directions. Sleep, movement, nutrition.
Yes.
And I've heard you say before that we are essentially amino acid foraging machines. So I noticed you said protein. You didn't say you need a bagel. You said protein. We could go down that rabbit hole. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But I want to use this also just as a quick opportunity to say, as you're saying all this, one can immediately understand why alcohol and drugs of abuse are both so compelling, right? You're not feeling well.
Yeah.
So you're feeling tired, take a stimulant that releases dopamine and epinephrine, but you're taxing your already taxed body budget in a way that then puts you in a more depleted state later. Or alcohol, you feel lousy. Alcohol never did this for me, but friends I have who are recovered alcoholics will tell me that it was like a magic elixir. It made them feel right. That's their language.
Yes.
But then, of course, there's a price to pay later, because then it drops your baseline below where it was initially.
Absolutely. 110%. But I just also want to say that so is serotonin. So are SSRIs maybe. Mm-hmm. And when I say maybe, what I mean by that is, if you really have a metabolic problem, like say something's wrong with your mitochondria, or you're recovering from an illness, and or there's just some metabolic problem in your body. That metabolic problem is real. If you start to feel unpleasant, feel unpleasant. Your mood will be negative. If you start taking SSRIs, which will leave more serotonin in the synapses of your neurons before it's taken up again, that will juice the system. You will be able to spend. You'll be able to move. You'll feel like you have more energy for a while. But your nervous system is a complex system, and so it's going to make adjustments elsewhere to try to deal with that budgeting problem. So exactly what happens when you take drugs of abuse and what happens on the short term can happen for some people with SSRIs on the longer term, where at first it starts to work and then it stops working and you start to gain weight and because your metabolism is slowing because your brain is attempting to deal with that budgeting problem. So it really matters what the source is. It could be that your brain believes you have a budgeting problem, but there really isn't one. It could be that there really is one. These things matter to how you treat it.
One thing to just mention about SSRIs, and I, unfortunately, for reasons of confidentiality, I can't cite the source on this, but let me just say that somebody who's highly informed in the landscape of pharmaceutical treatments for psychiatric challenges has told me that there's an emerging theory among psychiatrists, there's kind of a collective emerging theory that one of the reasons why nowadays you hear about so-called treatment-resistant depression, but you did not hear about so-called treatment-resistant depression prior to the advent of SSRIs, is that there's a growing body of thought in the psychiatric community that SSRIs may, over time, as you're pointing out, deplete the very neural systems that subserve enhanced mood. So it's different than a drug of abuse that gives you a very acute effect, like methamphetamine or cocaine or alcohol, but that over time you may actually be pulling the very neural circuits and neurochemicals that would allow for positive affect deeper and deeper into the trenches, so to speak. And so there's a growing number of people who simply don't respond to the drugs any longer or other treatments.
Right. So I wasn't trying to say the mechanism is the same. I was basically saying the theme is the same.
Right. And I'm agreeing with you.
What happens over the short term with drugs of abuse happens over the longer term for some people with SSRIs, because it hasn't been recognized yet that at the basis, depression is a metabolic problem. And when you have a metabolic problem like diabetes or obesity or heart disease, it's not that causes depression. It's that there's a common problem, which is that somewhere in this very complex system of your metabolism, there's a drag, and it produces negative mood. And that's how you experience it. Sometimes it's productive not to turn that negative affect into an emotion. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes you just need to deal with the affective problem by dealing with your physical state. And that's the tricky bit, is knowing when is affect telling you something is wrong with the world, and when is it telling you that there's something wrong with your physical state that you need to attend to.
I think everything, to me at least, starts with a good night's sleep on a consistent basis. And every psychiatric challenge, and indeed suicide itself, seems to be associated with and often preceded by challenges in sleeping, changes in circadian rhythm. So I think that's why, to me, sleep is the foundation of mental health and physical health.
Yep, absolutely. And so when I tell people, when they say, well, what can I do? I was like, well, if there's only one thing that you could pick, I would say get a good night's sleep on a regular basis. If you could pick two more, I would say eat healthfully. Like, stop eating pseudo food. Don't get me wrong. Like, I love French fries. They're God's delicious. Most perfect food. I mean, really. But eat healthfully, eat real food, and get exercise. And if you do those three things, I know I sound like a mother, and so feel free to roll your eyes at me. But as a neuroscientist, those are before you start with all the, mentalizing Jedi tricks, you could just start with this, and that would actually take you pretty far.
And that will resonate very well with our audience. The basics of sleep, exercise, food, sunlight, and social connection
I
are
was
the
gonna
ones that we
say,
just anchor to.
yeah.
Those 5 are the ones that we just keep returning to over and over
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
And I think people will say, oh, it's just simple motherly advice. But I think that those 5 things, even just the one thing around sleep,
Yeah.
there's some work that's required to get that done. So it's not as simple. The categories are simple,
Mhm.
but the work that's required to get great sleep as often as one can on a consistent basis, if you're raising kids, have a career,
For sure.
live in the world, there's a lot there. And so that's where I think there's an elaboration of things. And one needs to learn to be flexible. Like when
For
you're
sure.
traveling, how do you do that? When friends are visiting, how do you do that? When weather's off, and so on. The relationship piece is something.
I was just gonna say,
No,
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'm
Yeah.
so glad you mentioned
because
that.
you've said before, and this was another one of those moments. I've listened to as many of your podcasts as I possibly can, but I think it was the first or the second one with Lex Friedman, where you said, we are regulating each other's nervous systems. And I will never forget that. And, I imagine that you married your husband for a number of different reasons, but when people pair up with romantic partners, with friends, with coworkers, the ideal situation is one in which we are not taxed, where maybe even people, and just being around them or just knowing that they are in our lives provides a sort of deposit to.
Yeah, it's a savings. It provides
It's a savings.
for sure.
Yeah. And then I think that's a lot of what emotional resonance, to put
Yeah.
kind of pop language on it,
Yeah.
is all about. Who feels good to be around, who doesn't feel good to be around.
I would say the best thing for a human nervous system is another human. And the worst thing for a human nervous system is also another human. And so you really want to be around the people who make you the best version of yourself that you could be. And that doesn't mean that you always get a savings. Like sometimes you're taking care of that person. And so you're absorbing some of their burden, right? And vice versa. But I would say the research on, social isolation and loneliness and so on shows us that, along with research on synchrony, and there's just a whole bunch of research to suggest that we are the caretakers of each other's nervous systems. And it doesn't matter what your opinion is. Like it doesn't, that's how we evolved as a species. And so you get to decide, what kind of a person are you going to be? Are you going to be a savings, or are you going to be a tax?
And in general, it seems that people who decide that they're going to be a savings tend to, because people gravitate towards that and want more of that.
Yeah.
And hopefully would provide that also. I mean, I think the reciprocity piece here feels really, really strong.
Well, that's a really interesting thing about the synchrony work, right? So there's work that if you put people together who don't even know each other, but if they like each other and they have a sense of trust, even after a couple of minutes, they start to synchronize their physical signals. Their heart rate starts to synchronize, their movements start to synchronize. Their heart rate probably synchronizes because their breathing starts to synchronize, right? And it's really interesting to see what you typically see is that who is pacing and who is leading. Like one person is the leader and then the other person is the pacer. And I got that language from when I learned hypnosis, by the way. And but it switches back and forth, like who's the leader. Like in a what we say good, like in an interaction that looks productive, it's switching all the time. Who is pacing and who is leading. It's not that always one person is in charge, so to speak, physiologically speaking.
We did a series recently on mental health with Paul Conti, who's a psychiatrist, and the word narcissism came up a few times because people have a lot of questions about that. And he emphasized that narcissists are not confident. They operate from a place of a deficit of pleasure. It's never enough, and an intense envy. Although that's not how they present, and they're often usually not aware of it themselves, but it's what leads healthy people to feel as if the interactions with those people, narcissists, often can be very compelling in the moment, but they feel very taxed afterwards and kind of confused by what happened.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it ties back to this lack of synchrony. On the positive side of things, it's also clear from what you just said that when people regulate each other's nervous systems in a way where people are making little deposits and providing savings for each other, or maybe things are just neutral, that those nervous systems are then in a position to like pay attention to other things too, and not just try and work out the dynamics.
Oh, for sure. Oh, and that's very true at work. So there's research showing that, especially in the creativity, sector, innovation sector of the economy, the best predictor of performance on the job is the extent to which people feel, after you account for sleep and watering and sleeping and feeding, right? Like the best predictor is the amount of trust that you have in your team and in your managers. Because if the world is predictable, things could be hard. But even when things are unpredictable, you have people, who have your back. And so basically what you're doing is they're making, deposits or savings. They're causing savings in each other's body budgets. So their resources can be spent on the harder things, which is, failing and, having to pick yourself back up and try again, which is, partly what you do when you're an innovator. So I think that there's also research to show that in your personal life, when you do random acts of kindness for people or when you're kind, in general, you derive also a body budgeting benefit from that. So for a while, I had a friend who we would meet each other for lunch once a month and, we would take turns paying. We could both pay for ourselves, but we got a double hit, He paid for me 1 month and then I would pay for him 1 month. And then, so we get the double hit of, being kind to someone else and, and also they got the, benefit of someone being kind to them. And I'll just say, I think kindness is I don't know that we have so many conversations about that in our culture right now, but I think kindness is very, very underrated and should be, like when I feel like shit, I bake bread for my neighbor who's in his 70s, him and his wife. That's what I do when I'm not feeling good. And, after I've taken care of the possible physical causes, and then I feel great because he's always so grateful. And then I felt like I made his day better. And then also he helps me in other ways, like with my garden and stuff, because he's just like a master gardener. And so I feel like we have this relationship where we help each other. And I know it sounds really sappy, and even though all the research backs up what I'm saying, it doesn't quite describe the feeling of when someone is just really happy because you just gave them a little surprise. There's just some juice in that, I think.
Well, in some culture out there, there's a word for that.